Hello everyone. Today we look at CAT 2019 Slot 1, Section 1 VRC, one of the passages that had come in the reading comprehension area. I'll be reading out the passage first, then we'll understand the passage in terms of the words in the passage, understand the passage itself, and then go to the questions. I've already marked a few words that could impact our understanding of the passage, and we'll look at the meanings of those words later. Free of the taint of manufacture. That phrase in particular is heavily loaded with the ideology of what the Victorian socialist William Morris called the anti-scrape or an anti-capitalist conservationism, not conservatism, that solaced itself with the vision of a pre-industrial golden age. In Britain, folk may often appear a cosy fossilized form. But when you look more closely, the idea of folk, who has the right to sing it, dance it, invoke it, collect it, belong to it, or appropriate it for political or cultural ends, has always been contested territory. In our own time, though, the word folk has achieved the rare distinction of occupying fashionable and unfashionable status simultaneously. Just as the effusive floral prints of the radical William Morris now cover genteel sofas, so the revolutionary intentions of many folk historians and revivalists have led to music that is commonly regarded as parochial and conservative. And yet, as newspaper columns periodically rejoice, folk is hip again, influencing artists, clothing, and furniture designers, celebrated at music festivals, awards ceremonies, and on TV, reissued on countless record labels. Folk is a sonic, shabby chic, containing elements of the uncanny and eerie, as well as an antique veneer, a whiff of Britain's heathen dark ages. The very obscurity and anonymity of folk music's origins open up space for rampant imaginative fancies. Cecil Sharp, who wrote about this subject, believed that folk songs existed in constant transformation, a living example of an art form in a perpetual state of renewal. One man sings a song and then others sing it after him, changing what they do not like, is the most concise summary of his conclusions on its origins. He compared each rendition of a ballad to an acorn falling from an oak tree. Every subsequent iteration sows the song anew, but there is tension in newness. In the late 1960s, purists were suspicious of folk songs recast in rock idioms. Electrification, however, comes in many forms. For the early 20th century composers such as Vaughan Williams and Holst, there were thunderbolts of inspiration from Oriental mysticism, angular modernism, and the body blow of the First World War, as well as input from the rediscovered folk tradition itself. For the second wave of folk revivalists such as Evan MacColl and Al Lloyd, starting in the 40s, the vital spark was communism's dream of a post-revolutionary New Jerusalem. For their younger successors in the 60s, who thronged the folk clubs set up by the old guard, the lyrical freedom of Dylan and the unchained melodies of psychedelia created the conditions of folk rock's own golden age, a brief Indian summer that lasted from about 1969 to 1971. 4 decades on, even that progressive period has become just one more era ripe for fashionable emulation and pastiche. The idea of a folk tradition being exclusively confined to oral transmission has become a much looser, less severely guarded concept. Recorded music and television for today's metropolitan generation are where the equivalent of folk memories are seeded. Let us now look at some of the words that could impact our comprehension of the passage. The passage begins with the phrase free of the taint of manufacture. Taint would mean contamination or pollution. So, free of the taint of manufacture would mean free of the contamination of manufacture. Heavily loaded. Heavily is, of course, in a strong way. Loaded would mean biased in one particular direction. Ideology would be ideas and beliefs. Victorian would be the person who existed in the Victorian age, that is the rule of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. Socialist would be a person who believes in socialism, which is a social and political system where the distribution, production, and exchange of goods is attributed to the members of the society and belongs to them. So the passage starts with free of the taint of manufacture, the phrase being heavily loaded with the ideology of what the Victorian socialist William Morris called the anti-scrape. Anti-scrape is a theory in which you protect instead of restore. Anti-capitalist, against the ideas of capitalism. Conservationism is protection, not restoration. Conservatism is having very traditional ideas. Solaced is took relief from. Pre-industrial golden age is the period of peace, prosperity and happiness before industrialization began, usually idealized. Folk would refer to, in this case, forms of art which were prevalent during a particular time. Cosy would mean in a very relaxed way. Fossilized would mean incapable of change out here. Invoke it, to call upon it. Appropriate is to take for one's use without permission from the owner. Contested territory would mean a contentious area, an area which is always opposed, debated, etc. When we go to the second para, we see rare is of course very, the occurrence of which is very less. Distinction is eminence. Effusive is a heartfelt gratitude. In this case, of course, it would mean a very overflowing or full of energy. Floral prints, of course, prints of flowers. Radical would mean somebody who is opposed to total and absolute change in a political system. Genteel would mean fashionable. Revolutionary intentions would mean aims, revolutionary aims, objectives. Revivalists are those who plan to bring back an old order. Parochial is a narrow or limited outlook. Conservative is, of course, a very traditional belief system. Hip is fashionable. Reissued is to start a supply once again. Sonic is related to sound. Shabby chic is in a deteriorated fashion but fashionable. So, for example, torn jeans would be shabby chic. Uncanny would be mysterious, eerie, frightening. Antique is having a lot of value because of its age and quality. Veneer would be a coating of. A whiff is faintly smelt, in this case, a small amount of. Heathen is not belonging to a widely held religion. Dark Ages would be the period of decline in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Obscurity would mean not known or difficult to understand. Anonymity, one whose authorship is unknown. Rampant would mean unchecked, unrestrained. Fancies would mean a tendency to like something. So, rampant imaginative fancies would mean unrestrained imaginative tendencies towards something. We come to the third para. Transformation is, of course, to change in character. Perpetual, continuous. Renewal is to start afresh. Concise would be in a few words. Summary would be, of course, an abridged version of something. Rendition would be an interpretation or a performance. Ballad would be a song, usually narrating a story. Acorn would be the fruit which falls from an oak tree. Iteration in this case would be uh, a new casting or uh, a new way of putting something forward. Anew is afresh. Purists would be people who are very, very traditional, stubbornly traditional. Suspicious, very cautiously wary. Recast, to put in another form. Rock idioms in the form of rock music. Rock music, of course, something, a music which is much more harsher than pop music, more uh, self conscious, and uh, usually anti establishment. Electrification would mean to supply electricity to something and sort of make it work on electricity. Thunderbolts here would mean a lot of inspiration. So there were thunderbolts of inspiration. There were a lot of inspiration, in a very quick manner and in large amounts. Oriental belonging to Asia, especially East Asia. Mysticism would mean spiritual beliefs. Angular would be hard cornered. Modernism would be the quality of being modern. Body blow would be a heavy punch, in this case, impact. Revivalists would mean, like we came across before, those who try to bring back a particular old order. Vital, important, and essential. Spark would be a small amount of something which leads to something bigger. Communism is, of course, a social and political setup where you have the production of goods, exchange and distribution in the hands of the community and in the hands of the public sector. Post revolutionary New Jerusalem would mean um, the heaven that is created post a revolution. Successors would be those coming later. Thronged, went quickly to. Old guard, the people who were previously in charge of a particular area. Lyrical freedom, the songs, an unrestrained freedom of Dylan, in this case Bob Dylan. Unchained melodies would be again unrestrained songs, tunes. Psychedelia would be drug induced hallucinations or the music that comes due to drug induced hallucinations. Golden Age is again a period of great prosperity and success. Indian summer, a period of success again, usually later in life. Ripe would obviously mean ready to be consumed. Emulation would be imitation, inspired imitation. Pastiche would again mean to bring back an older work and sort of imitate it in a certain way. Exclusively, in exclusion of all else, confined, restricted to, guarded, you know, sort of looked over. Metropolitan would mean belonging to a very large city, and seeded here means to begin to develop or grow. Now that we have looked at words that would impact our understanding of the passage, let's try to understand the passage as a whole and what was the intention of the author in writing what he did. Now, this passage was the toughest passage that had appeared in slot 1 of CAT 2019 in the reading comprehension area, and it was taken from an extract by the Guardian. The Guardian had taken an extract from a book written by Rob Young in 2010, and the CAT test makers had probably taken that particular extract and edited it out heavily and presented it as a passage. Now, the passage is only 515 words, but it is highly layered, very nuanced, and not so easy to understand, at least the way it begins. So, let's try to understand this particular passage. Now, the first paragraph starts with a phrase, free of the taint of manufacture. That is, a product which is not contaminated at the point of its manufacture or production. And it goes on to say that this phrase is heavily loaded with a certain ideology. The anti-scrape, anti-capitalist conservationism of socialist William Morris, which took relief from a pre-industrial golden age. So, uh, the author starts with trying to juxtapose uh, ideologies and then gradually moves on to apply it to folk art, folk culture, and specifically folk music. He then goes on to say that in Britain, folk appears in a cosy fossilized form. But he says when you look closely, the idea of folk has always been contested territory. So, in the first paragraph, what we understand is that uh, the author refers to a product which is free of the taint of manufacture, connects it with William Morris's anti-scrape ideology, which is what we looked in the meanings part, and then speaks about folk. So it is reasonable for us to connect the two and think that the author wants to talk about folk as free of the taint of. In the second paragraph, the author talks completely about how folk has become fashionable again. And he talks about newspaper columns periodically rejoicing about it. He talks about how folk music in particular contains elements of the uncanny and eerie, has an antique veneer, a whiff of Britain's heathen dark ages. You know, there is a lot of obscurity, anonymity, which opens up a lot of space for rampant imaginative fancies. So, if you look at the second paragraph is all about what folk music consists of and how it has become fashionable again. When we go to the third para, in the third para, there is a person who has been quoted, Mr. Cecil Sharp, who talks about how folk songs are in constant transformation, and it talks about uh, how these particular songs keep on getting better, or at least change by people deleting what they do not like and adding what they like. He compares this to an acorn falling from an oak tree, with every subsequent change making the song afresh. But author says there's also some tension in newness. And in the late 1960s, traditionalists or purists were very cautious of folk songs which were recast in rock form. And it continues with that. And it goes on to say that for early 20th century composers, that is the early 1900s, the composers got a lot of inspiration from the East, from hard edged modernism, and also the First World War, and from the rediscovered folk tradition itself. So the third paragraph is about how folk music transforms, and how people get their inspiration from various sources, etc. The last the fourth paragraph, is about the second wave and third wave of folk revivalists. The second wave came in the 1940s, where the vital spark was communism's dream of a post revolutionary New Jerusalem, sort of idealistic place after the revolution would bring down probably capitalism. And then to their younger successors in the 60s, the third wave, um, who went to folk clubs set up by the old guard of the 40s. It was the lyrical freedom of Dylan, the words of Dylan's songs, and unrestrained melodies induced by psychedelia that brought about folk's own golden age. But it was a brief Indian summer that lasted for about 2 years, from 1969 to 71. And 4 decades on. So this also indicates that this is written in around 2010. Even that progressive period of the 60s has become just one era of fashionable emulation, and uh, and the author says the idea of folk tradition being confined to oral transmission has become much looser, less severely guarded concept. And he uh, talks about today's generation uh, looking at folk music, okay, from recorded music and television, and that's where their memories of folk music are grow from, or are seeded. Now, if you look at this passage as a whole, and if I were to crunch it into a few ideas or a few sentences, I would say that um, the author starts off talking of folk music as free from the taint of manufacture. He superimposes it with certain concepts of the anti scrape by William Morris. He talks about how folk has become fashionable again. He then talks about how folk music transforms, its three waves of inspiration, and then goes on to say that for today's generation, uh, the equivalent of folk memories are seeded in recorded music and television. So that is what the passage is about. We now come to the questions following this particular passage. Question 1 says, at a conference on folk forms, the author of the passage is least likely to agree with which one of the following views. Which means that we are going to be given four views. Four views will be given, three of which the author will probably agree with quite strongly, but there'll be one view which he would probably not agree with or is least likely to agree with. We have to pick that particular view. The first option says folk forms, in their ability to constantly adapt to their to the changing world, exhibit an unusual poise and homogeneity with each change. Now this word itself is absolutely different from what the author has written about folk forms. He says that folk forms, uh, they constantly change, but they are not homogeneous with each change. So chances are that he is not going to agree with this particular view. Let's look at two. Folk forms, despite their archaic origins from the past, remain intellectually relevant in contemporary times. So the fact that folk forms transform and people take what they like and do not like, and then they try to mix it with contemporary issues and times, is what is written in the passage as well. So it's possible that the author is likely to agree with this. So this cannot be our answer. 3. The plurality and democratizing impulse of folk forms emanate from the improvisation that its practitioners bring to it. Now, in the passage, the author has given examples of this. By plurality, he means diversity. Democratizing impulse of folk forms is being open to a lot of people. Emanate is emerge. Okay, and the author is likely to agree with this view. So we can safely eliminate this particular option. When we come to 4, the power of folk resides in its contradictory ability to influence and be influenced by the present while remaining rooted in the past. Now, this is also an idea that the author talks about. Author talks about how folk transforms, and he is likely to agree that its power resides in its ability to influence and be influenced and still remain rooted in the past. So, this is a view that he is likely to agree with. So, like we suspected, the correct answer is option 1, that the author of the passage is least likely to agree with the view folk forms, in their ability to constantly adapt to the changing world, exhibit an unusual poise and homogeneity with each change. We come to question 2 of this passage. The primary purpose of the reference to William Morris and his floral prints is to show, and we have to complete this particular idea. So let's go to the passage where they talk about William Morris and his floral prints. So it's in the second paragraph. Just as the effusive floral prints of the radical William Morris now cover genteel sofas, so the revolutionary intentions of many folk historians and revivalists have led to music that is commonly regarded as parochial and conservative. Now let's come back to the question. So we have to answer what is the primary purpose of the author in referring to William Morris and his floral prints. What does he want to show? Does he want to show, one, the pervasive influence? Pervasive is a negative, unwelcome influence of folk on contemporary, that is the current times, art, culture, and fashion. No, author does not talk about unwelcome influence of folk at all. So it is not to show this. We can safely eliminate this option. Is it that is it to show that what is once regarded as radical in folk can later be seen as conformist? Now, this is the purpose of the author, because he speaks about the radical William Morris, who was a anti-capitalist, conservationism, anti-scrape, and uh, how his floral prints came to came came to be shown on fashionable sofas. So, fashionable would mean that people have started accepting it in the mainstream society, and so this could be the primary purpose, looks to be. Let's look at the other options. To show that despite its archaic origins, folk continues to remain a popular tradition. Now, this is something that is true with respect to the passage, but that is not what the primary purpose of the reference to William Morris and his floral prints is to show. So this is a very clever, what you say, option, but because it is true from the passage, but it is not, the purpose is not with respect to the reference to William Morris and his floral prints. So we can eliminate this. Is to show that what was once derided is criticized as genteel, fashionable, is now considered revolutionary. This is a completely distorted option, because it's actually uh, uh, the author wants to say that, you know the radical William Morris and his floral prints, which were considered revolutionary, have now become very fashionable and conformist and accepted in mainstream society. So we can eliminate 4 quite easily. We are left with option 2, as we suspected, that the primary purpose of the reference to William Morris and his floral prints is to show that what is once regarded as radical in folk can later be seen as conformist. So this is our answer. We come to question 3 of the passage. Which of the following statements about folk revivalism of the 1940s and 60s cannot be inferred from the passage? Which means that we'll be given 4 statements which can be inferred about folk revivalism of the 1940s and 60s. There'll be one which we cannot infer, that is, cannot conclude logically, and that will be our answer. So let's look at the options. Option 1 says it reinforced Cecil Sharp's observation about folks' constant transformation. This is something which we can very easily infer about folk revivalism of the 1940s and 1960s. There was a constant transformation, and yet it retained its original forms in some way. So this, since it can be inferred, it is not our answer. Second says freedom and rebellion were popular themes during the second wave of folk revivalism. The second wave was in the 1940s, and the author clearly talks about, um, you know, uh, revolutionary ideas, talks about a post revolutionary New Jerusalem, talks about bringing down capitalism. And these were all very popular themes. This can be inferred, and hence this is not our answer. If you look at 3, electrification of music would not have happened without the influence of rock music. Now, we cannot infer this, because we do know that rock music uh, was in the form of uh, electrification, but we cannot say that electrification of music would not have happened without the influence of rock music. This we cannot come to this conclusion. So this seems to be the answer. Let's look at 4. Even though it led to folk rocks golden age, it wasn't entirely free from critique. Yes, even this is mentioned. There were certain purists, traditionalists who looked at it with a lot of caution and were not very happy with casting folk songs into rock idioms. So, this also can be inferred, reasonably inferred. Okay, so our answer would be 3. So, which of the following statements about folk revivalism of the 1940s and 60s cannot be inferred from the passage? Answer is 3. Electrification of music would not have happened without the influence of rock music. We come to question 4 of the passage, which says, the author says that folk may often appear a cozy fossilized form because. This is with reference to folk. Okay. First, let's go back to the passage where the author mentions folk appearing as a cozy fossilized form. It's in the first paragraph itself, third line. In Britain, folk may often appear a cozy fossilized form. But when you look more closely, the idea of folk has always been contested territory. Now let's go back to the question. So why does the author say that folk may often appear a cozy fossilized form? Let's look at the options. 1. The notion of folk, the idea of folk, has led to several debates and disagreements. Now it has, but this is not the reason why it may often appear as a cozy fossilized form. Cozy means relaxed. Fossilized is belonging to a certain past and incapable of change, etc. So 1 is not our answer. If you look at 2, it has been arrogated for various, arrogated is used for various political and cultural purposes. It has, but that is not the reason why it may often appear as a cozy fossilized form. So 2 is also out. Third says, of its nostalgic association. Nostalgic is a yearning for the past with a pre-industrial past. Now this seems to be one of the reasons, because in coming to that particular sentence, the author talks about a pre-industrial golden age. So this could very well be our answer. Let's look at 4th also. Folk is a sonic, shabby chic with an antique veneer. So, yes, folk is, according to the author, has become a sonic, shabby chic with an antique veneer, but that is not the reason why he says it may often appear a cozy fossilized form. So, we are left with option 3, that the author says that folk may often appear a cozy fossilized form because of its nostalgic association with the pre-industrial past. In his lead up to the sentence, he talks about free of the taint of manufacture. He talks about a pre-industrial golden age. He talks about a yearning of a pre-industrial past. And this is the reason why he says that folk may often appear a cozy fossilized form. So our answer to this question is option 3. We come to question 5 of this passage, which says, all of the following are causes for plurality and diversity within the British folk tradition except, which means we will be given 4 options where 3 would be causes for plurality and diversity within the British folk tradition. 1 will not be, and that will be our answer. Now, plurality is of course more than one version of a particular folk song or folk art. Diversity would be a lot of mutations, a lot of changes, a lot of different versions to a particular song or art or culture. Let's look at the options. 1. The fluidity of folk forms owing to their history of oral mode of transmission. This is mentioned as a cause for plurality and diversity because of the fluidity of folk forms, because of their oral mode of transmission. It led to a lot of plurality and diversity within the British folk tradition. This is also marked or mentioned by Cecil Sharp, who the author quotes in the passage. So this cannot be our answer. Second, that British folk continues to have traces of pagan influence. Pagan is those not following widely held religions, usually not the Christian religion, from the Dark Ages. So this is also a cause for plurality and diversity within British folk tradition. Author mentions it in the second paragraph, and he says that British folk mixes a lot of things from the Dark Ages, that is the ages of a decline in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, and having traces of pagan influence, etc. So this is also a cause for plurality and diversity within the British folk tradition. So this cannot be our answer. We come to 3, that British folk forms can be traced to the remote past of the country. Is this a cause for plurality and diversity? Yes, because you can trace folk forms, folk music to the remote past of the country. Over the years there has been a transformation that has yielded plurality and diversity within the tradition. So this also is not our answer. We are left with option 4. It says paradoxically folk forms are both popular and unpopular. Now this has been mentioned in the second paragraph. So it is fashionable as well as unfashionable, but this is not a cause for folk forms to have plurality and diversity. Folk forms have come to be both popular and unpopular, but this is not a cause for different versions and different transformations of the British folk tradition. So this is our answer. So I repeat, all of the following are causes for plurality and diversity within the British folk tradition, except paradoxically folk forms are both popular and unpopular. It is quite a clever option because it is written in the passage, it is true, but it is not a cause for plurality and diversity. That is what we have to note out here.
Please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get notifications of future videos.